Well, I have a great idea for you. Here's
All right.
what you can do since you have a lot of free time. You get a VR headset, and you become one of those VR idols. Except your shtick is that you only talk about jazz.
You mean like one of the VR tuber, like, virtual...
Yeah. You could have ginormous titties or be a dragon, or both.
Yeah.
And you could just say, well, the thing about Wardell Gray is... And I shit you not, you would make millions on YouTube.
Probably. I mean, it would probably be
Twitch.
the only way to get people to listen to me talking about Wardell Gray.
This is Shellac Attack, a monthly jazz podcast with your hosts, Lily.
And Charlie.
A little late on that one, Charlie, but I'm keeping it.
I thought I was on time. But, you know, as many people I know say, it was close enough for jazz.
Oh my gosh. That's just insufferable. Okay. Today we're going to be giving you a little bit different of an episode. We're kind of splitting the podcast in half. While it is like a true episode where we're going to recommend music and put in some clips for you premium listeners, Charlie and I both picked an artist we have been listening to lately, and we're going to take half of the episode talking about Charlie's pick, half talking about my pick. So, yeah, we're really excited to do this because we've been holding off on doing like one of the more intensive full episodes about one character from the Book of Jazz. And yeah, but we're excited to talk about just the people we have been listening to or talking about lately. And I think, Charlie, you can go first.
Yeah, it's always fun to be excited about an artist or a piece of music or something and just delve into it kind of deeply. And, you know, you might move on to something else in a few days or a week or a few weeks and just keep that in the back of your mind. But I think it's great to do a deep dive into one artist and just enjoy their music for a little while and hear a lot of it together with not hearing much else. And so I've been listening lately to a tenor saxophone player called Wardell Gray. He was born in 1921, and he was mostly active in the 1940s. And the reason why I've been listening to him is this February 13th, which for us is in 2 days, is his centennial. He was born 100 years ago that day. And so that got me getting into his music and listening to some of the great stuff he did. And I've been doing some radio shows over at WCKR on his complete recordings where I'm going through the 20 hours or so of music on which he plays and just doing a chronological look at what he sounded like and what kind of music he made.
So would you like to start us out with the track?
Yeah, so why don't we start out with something from, I believe this is from 1948, and It's one of Wardell Gray's recordings. It's called Light Gray, which is composed by Wardell Gray. It's actually kind of an improvisation over to the chord progression to Fine and Dandy, which is a jazz song of the period. Here's Light Gray by Wardell Gray.
All right, and that was Light Gray, composed by Wardell Gray. Charlie, can you tell us a little bit more about this song?
Yeah, so it's one of the recordings Wardell Gray made in 1948. Sadly, it didn't get much recognition in the day. The recordings are pretty obscure, but it's one of the few sessions which Wardell Gray got to make as a leader. He would occasionally get to make these recording dates in the studio where he was in charge, and he would play these long, extended solos and these great improvisations. And this is one of his best ones, this Light Gray, which was sometimes released with the name Dumpy. Don't ask me why that's the name they chose for it, but it's more commonly called Light Gray. And the other
Much
songs,
better name.
yeah, the other songs from this date all have these wacky names, which they came out under. There's a blues called Stoned, which was also released as Baldy. One called Matter and Mind, which was also just released as Nothing. And then the last item of the date was called The Toop.
It sounds like a very, very strange version of like the Seven Dwarfs.
Exactly. they were all characters in some
Baldy,
strange.
Nothing, and Toop.
And don't forget Dumpy and Stoned. Yeah, I think the record label was trying to avoid paying royalties to the composers, so they just made up these wacky names.
Oh my god, I could totally just imagine it as this like R. Crumb, like disgusting Seven Dwarves. Sorry.
Exactly.
It's so funny.
But I like the Wardell Gray in 1948, and it's kind of him at his peak almost. He's really about as popular as he's going to be in terms of public exposure and people listening to him. And he was never very popular. He never had a huge commercial following. And part of the reason was that even though he sometimes got to make these recordings as a leader, like this one in 1948, he spent most of his life playing as a sideman in other people's bands, and he was kind of a featured soloist. And so this is in the late 40s, is kind of the end of the big band era, and when these swing era big bands are still going strong, but they're starting to get less and less popular, and the scene is moving more towards smaller groups and from dancing halls to nightclubs, and he kind of rides that wave as it peters out. And so he starts out in the big band of Earl Hines, but then he leaves that and settles in California for a bit, where he plays a lot with Charlie Parker and other musicians in the bebop scene in 1946 and 1947. And then right in this period, when this recording was made, he is heard by Benny Goodman, who's one of the most popular jazz musicians of the era. He had a great big band since the 1930s, and by some accounts, he was the most popular musician in America for a few years in a row. And Benny Goodman, who had kind of given up on the big band thing for a year or so, he just sort of threw up his arms and said, I can't deal with this anymore, and moved to California. And he heard Wardell Gray, and he was like, oh, I like that. And so he asked Wardell Gray to join him in this new group he formed in New York that played for a few months in New York and Philadelphia. And it was a great group, and kind of weird because it had Benny Goodman on clarinet, and Benny Goodman was one of the most A-type personality people you could ever imagine. He was always in charge, and he didn't like anyone else to be stepping on his toes and stepping on his territory, but he actually hired another clarinetist to play in this group, a Swedish guy called Stan Hasselgaard. And then there was Wardell Gray and some other great musicians. And it played this kind of bebop music, kind of music inspired by Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie, sort of more modern music. And Wardell Gray was a good way to do that because he incorporated a lot of that style into his own playing. But he was still sort of a traditionalist in other ways. He could kind of fit into both worlds. He could fit into the traditional swing style of Benny Goodman, or he could fit into the bebop music of Charlie Parker or Stan Hasselgaard. And he kind of evolved his style to fit both of those worlds. And that's why a lot of other musicians really valued having him along and were able to incorporate him into their own groups.
That's awesome. He sounds like the do-it-all man of that era.
Exactly. And he's kind of an incredible soloist. He's one of those people who, I mean, I'm biased maybe, but I always listen to his solos and I find they're so creative and so inventive, and he sounds fresh all the time. And that's one of the great things about him that I think people appreciated as well, is it was just like, you could just like turn on this creativity kind of at a moment's notice in random contexts. And we get lots of, a lot of the recordings that we have of Wardell Gray are these kind of informal recordings of concerts or nightclub gigs or radio broadcasts or, jam sessions, live performances. And he always sounds inspired no matter what the context is. And that's one of the reasons why I've enjoyed getting really into listening to his music, because I can do a deep dive into it and it sounds fresh, whether you're listening to him in 1943 when he started recording or at the end of his life in 1954. There's this freshness to it the whole time.
That's really interesting, because I find with a lot of musicians, as they get older, you can tell. Like, and it's not necessarily in a bad way. Sometimes it's, more experienced, or, you can especially tell when someone's singing because it's literally their physiology is changing. So that's really interesting that he still sounded fresh up to his last recordings.
And I think one of the interesting things is that he always sounded fresh, but he actually sounds quite different at the beginning of his recordings than at the end of his life. Partly because his first recordings come in 1943 or 1944. I think it's 1944. He as a young tenor saxophone player, he basically heard Lester Young, who we did a long podcast on previously, and heard Lester Young's early recordings and was like, that's it, that's the stuff, I want to play like that. And so he sounds, it's not like he's copying Lester Young, but it's quite clear that like the sound of his tenor saxophone and his improvisation, there's like a lightness and an airiness to him that just like is so clearly inspired by Lester Young. And then in 1946, he settles down in California, mostly around Los Angeles, although he played a bit in San Francisco. And he's in the nightclub scene there, and Charlie Parker is there as well. And so he hears a lot of Charlie Parker. He plays a bit with Charlie Parker. He makes a few recordings with Charlie Parker. And he's like, well, this is also great, so why don't I combine the two into one thing? And so that's part of this thing I was talking about, of him fitting into like the traditional camp or the modern camp of the day, bebop music or swing music, is because he's coming out of the swing style, but then he adapted his style to incorporate more and more of the sort of Charlie Parker bebop style. And so it evolves over time as he puts more and more of that into his playing, and maybe loses a bit of Lester Young and gains a bit of Charlie Parker or Dexter Gordon or other players in that style who were playing around him at the time. And so when Benny Goodman went looking for someone who could play something that sounded like bebop but that could fit with what he was playing, it was the perfect fit. And it's kind of interesting because 10 years before this, Benny Goodman had actually thought about hiring Lester Young to join his band. They kind of talked about it, and he toyed with the idea, and they did these rehearsals, and nothing ever really came of it. But it was Benny Goodman kind of wanted a Lester Young kind of player, and finally he got one. He when he hired Wardell
Right.
Gray.
That's really interesting. It's okay if you don't know the answer to this, but is there a reason you think why he never went solo or like got bigger?
Yeah,
than he did?
I think it's probably a few different reasons. I think, fundamentally, some people aren't that motivated to do it, in the same way that Benny Goodman was the most A-type personality you could imagine.
Right.
Some
Not
people,
everybody's like that.
Yeah, some people just don't care that much, and some people can thrive as a support character. And there were periods when Wardell Gray did have his own groups, but they tended to be small groups. They tended to be for specific engagements. He didn't really work hard to keep a band together, and he seemed to be pretty satisfied with that. And it's also coming at a time when the live performance and also the recording scene for jazz is changing quite a lot because of this sort of big band fading. The big bands were fading away, and sort of new conceptions of the way jazz could be played were coming up. But sadly, overall, the popularity of the music was decreasing, and that was partly because people were less interested in live music. It's kind of in the period when people were moving to the suburbs, and so a lot of the urban music scene was kind of struggling a little bit. And so it's not really a good time to be getting into music as like this sort of, new sensational thing, leading a band, having a bunch of employees, that kind of stuff.
Right.
So I think, he in connecting himself with these very popular figures like Benny Goodman, he did very well, but he really wasn't that interested, it seems, in trying to do it himself.
Because the way you describe him, especially like absorbing all of these other artists' like influence, he just sounds like kind of what I have encountered with, because I talk and hang out with like a lot of different musicians. He seems like the perfect music nerd, like the one who wants to try out all the new styles, the one who like would probably just sit and practice at home, but maybe not be so interested in like paving a new way themselves, but very open to new and different ways to play.
Yeah, exactly. And he, the people who knew him said he was very intellectual. He loved to read. He was very, a lot of musicians would come to him with musical questions. They were trying to work things out.
Right.
He would be a great person for them to sort of bounce things off of. But he didn't necessarily, and so a lot of the musicians really respected him a lot. But he didn't want to deal with people like nightclub managers or agents or
Right.
these kind of ancillary figures where once you reach a certain rung of popularity or even leadership, that's really a big part of being a musician, is dealing with the music world outside of musicians.
That's always sounds like the worst part to me. Like hearing stories from back then, especially of just like people not showing up and stuff. And it's still like that, like nowadays when there is live music. But yeah, I totally get it. I feel like a spiritual connection to Wardell Gray in like that way, where it's just like I just want to play my music, be a nerd,
Exactly.
do what I can.
So anyway, here's another track. This one is one with Benny Goodman. It's called Stealin' Apples. I think this is from 1949. That was the Benny Goodman Septet, Benny Goodman on clarinet, the great Wardell Gray on tenor saxophone. That was actually from 1948, September of 1948, an old Fats Waller song called Stealin' Apples. And it kind of shows this Benny Goodman attempt to incorporate bebop into his own bands. You got Wardell Gray, and then there's also a nice trumpet solo by another obscure and sort of tragically short-lived bebop player, Fats Navarro. And then maybe we'll talk about Fats Navarro some other time. But it has a nice Wardell Gray tenor saxophone solo, and it's kind of, despite Benny Goodman being very hard to get along with, Wardell Gray was in his band for a while, several months, in this period. And then eventually, when Benny Goodman reformed his big band, Wardell Gray was in it for a little bit, but then he decided it was not really for him, so he quit. But it's interesting the way that these sort of Lester Young parallels keep coming up in his life, because he sounds a lot like Lester Young, and everyone sort of considered him to be a player in the Lester Young style, and he still hung on to that, even though it became less prominent in his later playing. But after being with Benny Goodman, who'd originally thought about hiring Lester Young, he was hired by Count Basie, who was Lester Young's original band leader, and it was with Count Basie that Lester Young really became popular. And Count Basie, like Benny Goodman, had sort of his big band had gone broke. There wasn't enough work, so he disbanded and formed another small group. And so you then get Wardell Gray in this Count Basie octet. Typically, it was like 8 of them. And he's with Count Basie for a while, for about a year, and makes a lot of great music in that group as well. And so, in a way, Count Basie is trying to have another Lester Young in his band by hiring Wardell Gray.
Interesting. It's very interesting.
So, those are kind of the two big, the most prominent sort of jobs that Wardell Gray had in his life. He sort of, I guess those were his peaks in 1948 and 1950. And there's lots of other moments when he has some pretty prominent engagements, but those were the two bands with which he kind of really had an impact. And it's interesting because with these big bands, typically if you're just one person out of 12 or 15, there isn't that much attention paid to you. But because these were smaller groups, they he was the only tenor saxophone player, so he was pretty prominently featured.
Yeah. Is there like a certain impact, since you've had to do like so much research and listen to hours and hours of this music, that he's made on you lately?
Yeah, I think it, one of the things is I think focusing in on that freshness and trying to understand sort of how improvisations can really have that originality, and what the nature of originality is in jazz improvisation. And I think he's a great way to do that. And because in doing this exercise, I'm really just going through and listening to the songs, but especially listening to the solos and trying to pick those out of these random events. And another thing which is interesting about going through his discography, it's kind of similar to doing it with Charlie Parker, is there's a few studio recordings, but there's a lot of random music from random contexts. And, as I said, there's these concerts, nightclub performances, radio broadcasts, pre-recorded radio shows. There's even a few film performances. And trying to hear how jazz musicians in this period would play differently in different contexts. So, for example, if he's on that Stealin Apples with Benny Goodman, they're in a studio. He's working for Benny Goodman, who's going to give him one chorus of the song to solo in a fixed arrangement, and seeing what he does with that, compared to, say, an event that, was probably about a year after that, where he's after hours in a restaurant in Framingham, Massachusetts with Charlie Parker, and they're reunited years after their initial interactions, and they're just jamming, and he jams for like 6 or 7 choruses on a solo, and he just like goes wild. He plays until he can't play anymore. He plays until he's done with his inspiration, and he doesn't necessarily know it's being recorded, and he certainly wouldn't think that anyone would ever listen to it again. Certainly not in a broad sort of popular way. And trying to hear how those different kind of approaches to making music would be different, but also be the same. Like, what are the similarities between them?
Yeah. Being a musician during that time, you have to be incredibly flexible. So, yeah. But that recording you described, I want to go ahead and listen to that.
Yeah, it would be...
It sounds amazing.
Yeah, it's incredible. I'll send it to you. We could include it, in fact. We could play it. It's 15 minutes long, so it's
well,
you gotta strap in. But the thing which is amazing about it is, like, you hear this Wardell Gray solo, and it's like, nothing's ever gonna beat that. That's incredible. And then Charlie Parker comes in and he plays for nine choruses.
That's amazing.
And it's just like the longest. It's, by some accounts, it's the longest recorded solo that Charlie Parker has of what we have of his. And Charlie Parker usually plays for like one or two choruses, and he just like goes wild. And then after that, there's a piano solo, and then they do these like trading bars things where they're like playing 4 bars each, dialoguing with each other and the drummer, and it's incredible.
That's awesome. That's something that reminds me of when we used to go see live jazz music in Chicago, and I think it's something that a lot of people miss out on since, like, it's a little bit more of a niche thing now to do, like, one, see like live music play, since like everything else is so more convenient, and at your fingertips, and then two, seeing jazz play live is when you're in the bar like really, really late at night, and then they're literally, the saxophonist is putting all the rest of their breath for the day.
Yeah.
And just kind of going, and there's sometimes a point where they don't care that you're there.
Yeah.
And they're just going at it and expressing themselves like in their favorite way.
Yeah.
Yeah, I always think moments like that are truly remarkable. So to get something like that on tape sounds amazing.
Yeah, and it's from the listener's perspective, it's it's a compromise because the sound quality on those recordings tends to just suck, plain old be terrible. But for someone like Wardell Gray, or especially for someone like Charlie Parker, it's worth it because you get those moments of genius shining through, and it's like the freshness of it. And neither you or I are going to go see Charlie Parker or Wardell Gray because they died in 1955, and there's no other way for us to get it.
Whose tickets did I buy?
Oh, sorry. That was my scam. I'm trying to sell tickets to a Wardell Gray show. And I kind of hinted at it, but it's a sad story, and its final conclusion, Wardell Gray dies very young, sort of like Charlie Parker. He dies in 1955. He had some problems with drug abuse, as with many of the musicians in that scene in the period, and he controlled it better than some, but it was not an easy time to be a musician. And he dies under kind of mysterious circumstances. He'd gone to L.A. for a gig in Benny Carter's big band, and he played the first couple of sets of the day and then didn't show up to the third set. And then later that day, his body was found in a ditch on the outskirts of Las Vegas with his neck broken.
Oh my God.
And so there's some conflicting accounts of what happened. It seems likely that he actually just overdosed, and then the other musicians who didn't want to have a dead body of one of their co-workers in the hotel room drove out and left it in the desert to try to take the spotlight off of them, but it's still kind of a mystery. No one really knows for sure.
Oh my God. That's crazy.
So it's a sad ending, and it came after a few years of not much going on in his musical career. There wasn't, in the early 50s, there wasn't that much work for people like Wardell Gray. That was one of the problems with being the eternal sideman, is that when the big names like Benny Goodman and Count Basie could keep getting work, people like him had a much harder time of it.
Right. That's crazy. That was a very impactful way to end.
Yeah. But the stuff he made in those 12 years of music is incredible. There's a lot of
yeah, it sounds like it.
Genius in there. And as I said, I've been enjoying discovering it over and over again.
For the first time.
Anyway, for the last track that I picked out is one of these Count Basie items with the Count Basie Octet, and it's from 1950, and it's called Little White Lies. So that was the Count Basie Orchestra, a song recorded in 1950, something called Little White Lies, and that lovely tenor saxophone solo was by Wardell Gray. That's the end of the Wardell Gray story for today, at least. I'm going to keep listening, and hopefully some of you will be inspired to check him out too.
Are you still working on it?
Well, I still have a few shows to do, and I've got about 90% of the recordings, but I got to get that last 10%. Got to complete the set.
It's always the last 10% that is the most difficult.
Exactly. But I'm not the only one who's been listening to jazz. I understand you've been checking out someone as well.
That's right. For once, I have also been listening to jazz in my free time.
Good. For someone who hosts a jazz podcast, one pretty important.
Yeah. Because I'm not always I'm into a lot of different music, so sometimes jazz gets put to the side for a while while the passion is still there. But one artist like that I keep returning to myself is this artist called Dearie. Have you heard of her, Charlie?
I have, and I've occasionally heard her as well.
Right, so she's this amazing jazz pianist and singer. And I don't know, there's a lot to say about her, and she has so much personality that I think I would just like to set it up with a song first.
Which one is
kind
this?
Kind of set the mood. I'm going to set it up with Manhattan by, I don't know who it's by, but it's a jazz standard, and this is Dearie's version of it.
Just had to pick a song about me.
All right, that was Manhattan performed by Dearie. I just wanted to start out with kind of a jazz standard, because while she is a jazz musician and very much was taught in the school of jazz piano, she has a lot of different recordings and kind of brings a lot more attitude. While Charlie's artist was obviously in the 1940s, mine, while not totally contemporary, is slightly more modern. She even passed away in the 2000s, so choke on that, Wardell Gray. I am totally in love with this song, though, and especially after living in New York for a while. The lyrics are like beautiful to this song, but when you go to New York City, I highly recommend you listen to this version of the song. It's very, very gentle. It's very, very soothing, and while New York doesn't always seem like the most beautiful place, when I listen to this song, it definitely feels that way.
Yeah, I think one of the things I really love about her is, she really sings the songs themselves. She's not just using the songs as this kind of just way to show off her singing. It's her voice always seems so appropriate for the lyrics, and she always seems to take them at the right pace, and there's an emotional involvement in her singing that I really appreciate a lot.
Well, it's really funny because I was reading about her, to prepare for this, and she always described herself as a pianist who was learning how to sing. So there's none of that, like, pretension. There's none of that. It just is like her and her personality. This song, is a very, like, sincere song, and she sings it extremely well. But you'll find, like, on her other tracks, she has a little bit more of a sass and an attitude and a kind of humor to her as well. I wanted to set it up with something a little bit more traditional, like I said. And she has such a unique voice.
Yeah,
Like,
it really doesn't sound like any other jazz singer.
Or any other human
Yeah.
that I know. It's one of those rare vocalists who have such, like, a high voice, like almost impossibly high. Her voice is also, like, extremely sensitive. It's just like, it really sounds like she's struggling to sing at times because it's, like, hard to get the noise out of that, like, squeak box or something.
Yeah, it's and it's very soft. Like, it's amazing that I would have loved to have seen her live to see how, like, she would project the volume, because it sounds very soft and very it's not quiet, but it's a very delicate sound.
Yeah, but that's also what makes it wonderful to listen to, like, on headphones, is that it is, like, so delicate, and it's just kind of floating above, like, her very, very rich piano playing.
Yeah.
Like, her talents as a piano player is amazing, and she's very, very dreamy, and also is an amazing composer, like, as well. Always does jazz standards, like, a lot differently than I would imagine them or how they have, like, been played in the past. She's not afraid to, like, slow things down or speed them up or add, like, some vocal ease riffs in there, because she's, like, in this interesting time where it's going from, like, 50s to 70s. And so there's a lot more experimental things going on in some of her recordings. You can definitely hear, like, a grooviness happening and, like, more of a beat. She was just a very interesting character, and I have been listening to her a lot, I think because it's been snowing here.
It is,
and I always feel very, like, nostalgic for the New York atmosphere when it snows. And she is very, very much a New Yorker. She was also raised in Europe, but she does have a very almost, like, Woody Allen-esque character to her voice. She has, like, a very thick, it's not so much an accent. She speaks very properly, like they did back in the day. But she has, like, this little birdie voice with, like, she says things in very peculiar ways. I was listening to an interview with her, and I couldn't remember what the word was, but there's a word, and I'm like, I've never heard it said that way before by any human.
One of the things which I love about her is she lived in France for a few years and kind of had some connection to French jazz and French music, and there are a few times in jazz music when you get these recordings of vocalists and they do, like, the song in one language and then they'll do it in another language on the same recording. And typically they do it in their native language and then they do it in the other language, and it's, like, a little bit of a struggle to get through. Like, there's this set of recordings by a singer, Midge Williams, from Japan in the 30s.
Oh, yeah.
And I think I've played those for you before. And she just, like, phonetically reads out the Japanese lyrics to the St. Louis Blues, but when you play it to someone who speaks Japanese, they're like, wow, that's bad. But when she sings in, she has these recordings where she sings in French and in English, and, like, the voice is impeccable in both languages. Blossom Dearie, she just really nails it.
Right. but it's impeccable, but it's also still in her own voice.
Exactly, yeah.
She got very, very popular in France, and she lived in Paris for a while and was like, for those of you who can't just like gather it by her singing style yet, she was sort of like a cabaret lounge singer. So like in small clubs, she would perform on the piano with her little voice, and sometimes with other groups. And she also made a bunch of other groups. She set one up with Annie Ross, actually. I don't remember what it was called, but that happened in Paris. So she's a very interesting person. Loves French culture, tons of songs in French. Could obviously speak pretty fluently. Her parents were Scandinavian, and so that's why her full name is her real name. Blossom Dearie, so Dearie is apparently a real last name people have. But Blossom, they named her Blossom because she was born in the springtime. And she also has a Christian name, and I don't know if that's the technical term for a legal name or technical term for like your, what is it when you get baptized you give them a name, or is it when you...
Yeah, I think when you're baptized you're given the Christian name.
I'm very bad at those types of things, but in the interview I listened to, she said her real name I think is like Marget or something, like the Scandinavian version of Margaret. And it's Margaret Blossom Dearie on her birth certificate, but it's the opposite, Blossom Margaret Dearie on her passport. So she doesn't really care. And people are always extremely, Blossom is a very, very interesting name, but it suits her so well.
Yeah. It's a good name. Well, people should use it. That's
yeah, I totally agree. Yeah. I think, yeah. And it was such a cute story too, where it's just like my older brother brought in blossoms, and so my father named me Blossom. Like, I love stories like that. Like, don't you miss when people would be named by just like the circumstances under?
Yeah, it's sort of like,
or maybe that would be bad. I don't know.
It's sort of like a person being destined to be eccentric and just a little bit characterful. Right.
But if you were like born in the back of a taxi cab, you wouldn't want to be Taxi Cab Johnson. Yellow Cab Thompson. But yeah, she was an incredibly smart, and interesting person. You'll find a lot of kooky names for her songs. She would often like collaborate with a bunch of different lyricists, including most like notably the person who wrote I can't remember his name, but he wrote Moon River, and he wrote the lyrics for Jeepers Creepers.
Yeah.
Where'd you get those peepers? Yeah, she was really good friends with him, and she collaborated with a lot of like great songwriters. But she has like songs called like Peeling a Grape, Peeling Grapes, and just a lot of interesting, more goofy train of thought sort of style.
Seems like they would fit into the Wardell Gray track name selection.
Oh, yeah. That is something they have in common.
Yeah, is it Johnny Mercer who wrote Moon River, I think?
Yeah, Johnny Mercer.
He wrote the lyrics to Moon River, yeah. Yeah.
By the way, the interview I listened to was Marion McPartland's Piano Jazz.
Yeah. She was...
Have you heard of that before?
Yeah, she was a great pianist who had this, I think it was on PBS, it was like a series where she would play with other pianists, and there's great performances of her with like Teddy Wilson and many other musicians and like Benny Carter, and she would do interviews and then play either with a musician or let the musician play on their own. And it's kind of one of the great TV series of one of the great jazz TV series, because it was really hosted by a jazz musician who knew what they were doing and knew what they were talking about. So it was very well presented, and you can still find the recordings. And she had a pretty interesting life. She was English originally, and she met this trumpet player from Chicago, Jimmy McPartland, who was in the U.S. Army in the Second World War, and who was preparing to go land on the beaches in Normandy in 1944. And they met right before he had to go off and fight in France. And he said, if I survive this, I'm going to come back and marry you. So he went off and he landed on Omaha Beach and apparently played the trumpet while the boats were approaching, and he fought in France, and then survived the war. And when he went back to the States, he picked up Marion McPartland, Marion, and then made her McPartland once they got back to the States. And but she was a great jazz pianist, and she ended up having this radio show, this TV show, which was very notable. And
it was really great because the guests play live, and then she improvises with them.
Yeah.
Incredible, and like just a great conversationalist. And I always think older interviews are very interesting because they have that like very proper Atlantic way of speaking. So incredibly interesting. I might as well play a song that was selected in one of those, which was a Johnny Mercer tune, which is a song about sweetly and lovingly stalking someone. So just to get a good sense of like her humor and her like genuine, attitude. It's called I'm Shadowing You. So that was I'm Shadowing You, performed by Blossom Dearie, with lyrics written by Johnny Mercer. It's like this hilarious song about just you'll never get away from me because I am following you everywhere.
Sweet or creepy, depending on the perspective.
Right. And so a lot of her lyrics are very, very fun, very tongue-in-cheek. It's not just like all jazz standards. And like even her own lyrics that she writes, they're all very, very sassy. And she performed live like a lot because obviously her lounge style of like performing and singing came from somewhere. And she would have basically, when she had like her own like proper like place to play where people would come to see her play, and it wasn't just like a visiting musician. It was always, I read a bunch of things like that would happen. She would tell people in the middle of her set to like shut up. She would like stop. And then she would also, there was no eating allowed, I think, while she was playing. Like there's no service at the clubs. And then she also was extremely sensitive to smoke and would lose her voice often.
Wow.
So 10 minutes beforehand, everyone, it was very, very common to smoke indoors, especially in bars. Everyone had to stop smoking.
That must have been a struggle in nightclubs in the 60s. It's kind of when everyone was smoking all the time. That's really amazing.
Yeah. Yeah, she was just like very much a character. And it's funny because I definitely don't hear a lot of people talking about her. I actually found her a long, long time ago when I was working in a grocery store, and I would often, I didn't have enough money to even like afford Spotify, but my work did. And so when I would like pick a station, I think I picked like a Chet Baker station, and I would play a lot of jazz, and everyone on Sundays, they knew the person because I had like total control.
Yeah.
There would always be jazz on Sundays.
I would come in and there would be good music.
Yeah, it was pretty fun because people would walk in and be like, I'm so calm all of a sudden. Or like, it was a very good vibe. It was very fun. Like, people would come in and try to like guess what I was playing and stuff.
Yeah.
Or try to impress me by that was...
Yeah, they'd walk in and they'd be like, wait, this is good?
Yeah. Yeah, it's very, very fun. Like, but so that's... Blossom Dearie ended up being on one of those like mixes where, you know, you pick a general artist and then like the computer makes a mix based on what you like. And so that's how I found Blossom Dearie, and I was just so like enraptured by her voice, and her, I don't know, she takes her like craft very, very seriously, and everything is very sincere the way she sings it.
Yeah. And the thing that I always love about her is how very much like all the artists we tend to talk about here, it's like she has so much individuality, and it's so distinctly her style, and you can really recognize her playing, and it's just there's so much like of her own personality imprinted on her music, and I really love that.
Yeah, and just an incredibly fun like catalog to listen to. She tries like a lot of different things, like I mentioned, like vocalese, or her recordings are definitely very, very different than her like live playing. Where her live playing is just solely her on piano for the most part. But then in the studio, there is this big emphasis on like groove and rhythm in some of the songs, and a more experimental approach to like how things are composed. Like, they're very, very impressive pieces of music. And so that's one of the reasons why I've been listening to her lately, is just the way she fleshes out her songs. She does in like so much more experimental way than like anybody I had ever heard at the time. Yeah, just super impressive, and she also doesn't make me depressed like when I listen to her. She's like, there's a very like happy, chipper feeling, even though she has some very, very serious, like sad, sentimental songs that I also adore. But now I mostly just like listen to her to like have a good time, and those like tongue-in-cheek lyrics, the amazing like piano and percussion like that accompanies her. It's just like totally inspiring, and definitely helps me just like move about my day.
Yeah. And yeah, as you said, there's like a kind of optimism to her music, which is, even in the sadder songs, there's something uplifting about them.
Yeah, just an excellent character like in the world, and I think that deserves a lot more notice, because I feel like she's kind of been brushed off to the side a little bit, where I think especially like collectors of music or like strange eccentric things, like a lot of people have been getting into like strange like funk and like things like that. So like, why not jazz? Why not Blossom Dearie?
Yeah. And especially for people who are interested in the singers, for whom the instrumental music isn't really to their taste. She has that instrumental aspect, but she's also this incredible singer.
Yeah. Yeah, just such incredible work. And as I was like listening to that interview with her, I was just like fading in and out of sleep, like on the couch, and it was the most relaxing thing. Yeah, she, like I said, died in 2009. I think she was like 85 or something like that. Yeah, in New York City, I don't know, she's a very New York City attitude sort of person. You know, on the optimistic side.
Yeah.
You know. And I think I'm just going to leave you guys with probably my favorite song that I'm obsessed with. I listen to almost every Sunday. It's called Sunday Afternoon. All right, and that was Blossom Dearie singing Sunday Afternoon. Such a wonderful, delightful, airy song with a lot of groove in it. I very much enjoy the song. It's my favorite one of hers.
Absolutely. It's got that. It's kind of peppy. Like, I like how
it is peppy. It is. To me, it's like the perfect driving Sunday drive song. Like, because that's what it just feels like.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's just, I don't know. Plenty of people.
Yeah.
And her vocal improvisations in that, like, where she just randomly, all of a sudden, it's just like, and she just like throws it in on top. In the recording, I think it sounds like after the fact, and that the fact that she was willing to do more experimental things and improvise like vocally on top is very great, and just something I like to do in my own music. I can't say enough about this recording. I really like it.
Well, I think we've covered it. There's certainly a lot of great music there. And she is also one of those people who's worth just continuing to listen to and going back to over and over again.
Yeah, and there's a big range of things you can listen to. Like, one thing I think I'm going to listen to after this was she did there's an album they made based off of the songs she did for like a root beer company. And so they're just like a lot of weird, interesting albums that I think like weird music nerds, you know, who like to find the gems, like me, will very much enjoy listening.
Absolutely. All right. Well, we've covered what we're listening to in the jazz field.
Yeah, we did the thing we said we would do.
We set out to do this thing, and I think, you know what? I'm just going to go out on a limb and say it. We both have excellent taste.
Let's just pat ourselves on the back right now. No, I'm very, very excited to listen to more Wardell Gray, because I know I definitely have heard him on recordings before, but I have never looked into him individually.
And I'm glad that you talked about Blossom Dearie, because it made me revisit some of her recordings that I have and really enjoy, and it's delightful, and I think after this I'm going to listen to more of it.
Hell yeah. This is what it's all about, baby.
Even if we only get each other to listen to jazz, it'll still be worth it.
That's right. All right, so this was the latest episode of Shellac Attack, our Wardell Gray and Blossom Dearie special. Bet no one else in the world would put those two together.
Yet here they are.
Yet here they are. We have a premium version of this with all of the sound, with clips of the songs we talked about on our Patreon, which is only $1. But I'll probably put a playlist in the description like I usually do, in case, you know, you're not into that. And yeah, take the time to check out Jam Eater Records' other things. We have Jam Eater Records podcasts that interview a lot of DIY musicians. Charlie and I try to put out a Shellac Attack episode every month, if not maybe even possibly twice a month once. Maybe we did that.
That's a dangerous standard to set for ourselves.
Well, I'm just saying I think we did that one time.
That's true.
So I like to say maybe we do a little more. But thank you so much for listening. If you have any questions, we would happily send you in the right direction or answer them if we can.
Absolutely.
Thank you for listening. We've been Shellac Attack as Lily
and Charlie.
Bye-bye.